let's hope it stays okay. Yeah, I don't know why the connection is so unstable, but it is. We'll see if we can get YouTube to begin, and then we'll see what we can do here. All right, I think YouTube has started. Let me jump over there and see what's happening. I see a notification. Nobody's saying anything bad about me, so that's always a good thing. Let's go to Theology Central. There we are. We'll see what we can do here.
World from a theological perspective. This
once
is the
again,
Theology Central podcast.
I do not know why YouTube does that. I have no idea why it does that. It starts one broadcast while I'm trying to listen to the live broadcast, and then it's just, I can't actually verify the quality of the audio going through. I don't know why it does that, but it does. All right, I think we have that ready to go. Now let me jump over here to Sermon Audio itself. See how many people are currently broadcasting. There are 5 webcasts currently going on. Oh, Old Paths Baptist Church, he's broadcasting. He's been on for 17 minutes. He usually gets a pretty good audience, so you can go check him out. We have a live webcast from VCY America. That's been going on for 17 minutes. We have a funeral occurring. And then we have something blurry that says Sunday morning service. Oh, there we go. I don't know what's happening. Oh, it's been on for 9 hours and 40 minutes. Tyler Primitive Baptist Church, you did not turn off your live feed. You have been broadcasting for 9 hours and 40 minutes. Okay. Someone may want to disconnect their live feed, right? So if you want to go see that, you can go check it out. All right. 41 people have tuned into that. It's probably not a good number if you've been broadcasting for 9 hours, but okay. All right, we'll get a second here and we'll get started. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin here in just a second. We're taking a little bit longer to get started than we normally would, and the reason I am is because of how wildly unstable our connection has been, and we already had one disconnect. So I'm trying to ensure that we're not going to have another one. That's the goal. So we'll get started here in just a second. And yeah, let's hope it goes well. I hope it does. All right, we'll get started here in just a second. I think we're good. All right, the only people listening are in the state of Texas or the country of Texas. Nobody else is tuning in, okay? Nobody else, but that's okay. That's all that matters. And yeah, we'll get started here. Yeah, the connection is crazy. I don't know. I'm just looking at the numbers and they're fluctuating like insane, right? Like the bottom is dropping out, then they're shooting way too high. So the indicator stays in green. It's not going to yellow, orange, or red. If it goes to red, that means there's going to be a disconnect. And so if there is a disconnect, just keep listening. Now, I won't be able to fix it while I'm broadcasting because when I'm broadcasting, if it disconnects, I just keep talking. And the reason I do that, I try not to even acknowledge the disconnect. Sometimes I will acknowledge it at the end of the broadcast, is because I'm focusing on trying to get a recording that doesn't have a 5-minute, space in there with me going, oh, we're currently disconnected. Wait, what's going on? Oh, hopefully, okay. All right, we're back. I don't want 5 minutes of the broadcast to be taken up with that. If I just mention it at the end, I'm at least acknowledging it. But because the recording software is not impacted. The internet can crash completely. The recording software is not reliant upon being connected to the internet, which is smart on my behalf because you want to have that redundancy. You want to have that backup plan. So that's why we use that. It cost us extra money to do that. But hey, it's worth it. All right. With all of that said, I don't think anybody else is going to tune in today. This is I've lost my entire audience. I have driven everyone away. Okay. I guess the last couple of broadcasts have been enough for people and they said, we're not listening to that guy anymore. All right. Well, if you do tune in, thank you very much. In the meantime, let's do this. I've got all of my notes. I've got what I need right here. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further delay, let's go live in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1.
Looking at our world from a theological perspective, this is the Theology Central Podcast, making theology central.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is Monday, March the 9th, 2026. It is currently 2:23 p.m. Central Time, and I'm coming to you live from the Theology Central studio, located right here in Abilene, Texas. Now, early this morning, around 1 a.m., 1:30 a.m., I was here in this studio. And what I had done is I went downstairs and I got my CD player, right? My CD player, my Yamaha CD player. And I brought it up here, put it right next to my stereo receiver. I hooked up the Yamaha CD player. And I'm like, well, okay, that looks nice. Okay, it's been a while since I've used my CD player. It's been forever. And I'm like, okay, it's around 1:30 in the morning. I'm hooking up a CD player. Don't really know why. Why am I even doing it? I don't even know what motivated me. It was just like, it's 1:30 in the morning. I don't know what else to do with myself. Let me go grab my Yamaha CD player and hook it up. So I hooked it up to my Yamaha preamp. I got it all set up and I'm like, okay, that looks good. All right, well, I guess let's go grab some CDs. So I went back downstairs. I opened the garage. I went in there and I started looking around because in my garage, I have a gigantic collection of CDs. Like, it's insane. You're talking thousands, okay? Because as anyone who knows anything about me, my life has been a long love affair with music. I tend to say music was my first lover, okay? Music has always been there for me. It's been my best friend. It's been my lover. It's been my companion. It's been my partner. It's listened to me. I've listened to it. It's just been there in my life. There's no way to get around it. If I say anything other, I would be minimizing the impact of music in my life. So I just started going through the stacks of CDs, and there's no way to get around this. There's a major section of my life where one type of music had a profound impact on my life. And that's contemporary Christian music. No way to get around it. So the house was quiet. Most of the lights are off. And there I am in the garage pulling CDs out of boxes and off shelves, stacks and stacks of them. Many of them were covered in dust. In fact, here's a bunch of them right here. Right? So I had to start, wiping off all the dust. And as I sat there looking at each one, years of music, years and years of music. And decades of memories. And as I flipped through the cases, Petra, Not of This World, Mylan and Broken Heart, Face the Music, Mylan and Broken Heart, Face the Music, Jennifer Knapp, Lay It Down, For Him, The Basics of Life. Those are just four that I just happen to have right here. I just grabbed four just right before I went live on the air. But as I flipped through all of these CDs, something kind of, I don't know if it's strange, something kind of expected started happening. Every album kind of brought back a memory. Youth group, even though I pretty much rebelled against youth group culture and refused to participate or refused to go to youth Sunday school classes because I was always, having my problems with church culture. Oh, one memory that definitely come flooding back was Christian bookstores. One particular Christian bookstore, the Bible bookstore, Abilene, Texas, Butternut Street. I could take you right where the building was. Another memory was, do you remember? Now, some of you may not remember, but many of the Christian bookstores back, especially in the 80s, would have these like listening stations, right? So you could be looking at all of the albums and you could be like, ooh, that one. And then you could go to the listening station and you could listen to that album to see if you liked it, whatever. Because in many cases, how were you going to hear a lot of these albums? Where were you going to hear them? That was always a difficult thing at that time because, well, Christian music, especially depending on how far you go back, was still, in a sense, the only way to kind of describe it was underground. It was counterculture. In fact, much of it was still counterculture to the church culture itself. So you would stand at those listening stations going, ooh, this is interesting. This is interesting. Now, in some cases, starting around that time, Christian radio stations started playing more and more of this type of music. So you would discover it. But again, when you discovered it, it felt like you were listening to something nobody else knew about. It was like, oh, I'm stumbling upon a music and a kind of music that no one else knows about. It's music that sounds like the music I want and I like and I listen to. It sounds like the music of the culture, but they're talking about Jesus. Oh, wow. That's crazy. I know it, that for you, you're like, what's the big deal? At the time, it felt somewhat revolutionary, almost like I'm discovering something no one else knows about. And all of these memories just come, it's 1 o'clock, 1:30 in the morning. I'm going back from the garage, back up here to the studio, back down to the garage, just bringing up stacks of CDs, sitting on the floor in front of the CD player, just opening them up, putting one in, throwing on headphones, hitting play, just going through them. And the feeling that I remember was I felt that this music belongs to me. As a young Christian teenager, I'm like, this music belongs to us. It's different than anything else. This is like us against them. I definitely felt that feeling. And for me, this is so important for you to understand. Contemporary Christian music was more than just music in many ways, especially at certain periods of my life. It shaped a part of my teenage years. It shaped my early adulthood. And in many ways, it even shaped my journey to Christianity, especially when I pick up this album, Petra, Not of This World. I remember hearing about Petra on the local Christian radio station, but I could not find a Petra album in a Christian bookstore. I had to go to a secular store, using that term, a secular record store, to buy this album, Petra, Not of This World. I got it on vinyl, and I was like, whoa, what is this? And then, because of that album and hearing of them on the Christian radio station, I ended up at a Petra concert at Hardin-Simmons University, Abilene, Texas. And really, that was the beginning of moving. That was kind of the beginning of me moving towards salvation. It really kind of set everything up for me becoming a Christian. In fact, in many ways, Petra is very instrumental in me being a Christian. I wouldn't be sitting here doing a Theology Central podcast in some ways if it wasn't for the band Petra. Now, many years later, downtown Omaha, Nebraska, Petra was at Homer's Records in the Old Market in Omaha, Nebraska. And I got a chance to run into that store and to thank them for really being instrumental in my salvation from a human perspective. So, me and contemporary Christian music, we have a long history together, and I'm not going to deny it. There's a love-hate relationship with it as well, which could be an entire different story. But that's not the story I'm going to tell you this afternoon. Because as I kept digging through these stacks of CDs, I stumbled onto something that just stopped me. An album that didn't just take me back to the beginning of CCM. It took me back to a time before CCM, contemporary Christian music, even existed. Back to a time when I was basically a toddler. I was a baby. The year? 1972. Now, I want you to think about the world in 1972. Some of you weren't alive. Some of you were young and don't remember much of 1972. Some of you do know, some things about 1972. I think there was something called the Vietnam War. Do you remember that? The counterculture of the 1960s had not fully faded. In some ways, you could say, well, the counterculture of the 60s was dead, but in 1972, it's still there to a certain degree. In 1972, the hippie movement is not like completely dead or over. It's still there to some level. And there's no question about it, in 1972, rock music is dominating youth culture. And I know when you think of the 70s, you can think of disco, but well, we could have an entire musical discussion of the evolution of music in the 70s. But just think, rock music is dominating youth culture in 1972. And churches across America, well, they still were not happy with rock music. They had not been happy with rock music since Elvis Presley started shaking his hips, okay? It was the devil's music. It was wrong. Drums were wrong. Drums were instruments of the devil. Guitars and drums, they do not belong in worship and they do not belong in church, and you should not be listening to them because they're evil. But somewhere in the midst of all of that, California, a small church gathering, maybe in a coffee house ministry, a young Christian picks up a record. Maybe a friend handed it to him. Maybe it was playing after a church service. Maybe it just happened to be sitting on a turntable in someone's living room, and the needle dropped on the vinyl, and suddenly they heard something that, and for the most part, well, that not had really been heard before. I mean, there are some examples of maybe before, but this is a very significant moment in musical history and in church history. Because when that needle dropped on that vinyl, it wasn't a hymn. It wasn't Southern gospel. Instead, you heard guitars, you heard harmonies. Sounded very much kind of like the California folk rock scene of the early 70s. But here's the thing. The lyrics were about Jesus. And for the first time, and again, I got to be careful to say the absolute first time, but as far as historical significance, we'll say this is one of the first times the sound of the culture outside of the church and the message of Jesus. I'm not going to say necessarily the message of the church. I'm going to say the sound of the culture outside the church and the message of Jesus that you may hear inside the church. Well, they all collided in music. And that album was called Love Song. Love Song. Right? Now, if you open up, say, a music streaming service, like let's say you open up Spotify, type in Love Song and look for the artist Love Song, you'll see the album. It says Love Song. It was titled, the band is Love Song. The name of the album is Love Song. And on some of the music streaming services that give you the date, guess what the date is for this album? March the 10th, 1972. March 10, 1972. Well, what's today? March the 9th, 2026. So immediately when I saw that, I'm like, oh, wow. It's the day before the anniversary. It's the day before the anniversary of Love Song by Love Song. And I'm like, okay, what do I do now? It's now like 1:45 in the morning, fast approaching 2 in the morning. I'm like, what do I do? What do I do? Well, I knew I only had one choice, so I listened to the album. I mean, come on. Of course I was going to listen to the album. Who needs sleep? I wasn't going to go to sleep anyway. I never sleep, so I spent some time with Love Song by Love Song from March the 10th, 1972. And I know in 1972, that listener, and one of those imaginary scenes and how they possibly stumbled upon the album, they obviously did not realize in that moment what no one in 1972 could have known. I mean, they would have had no idea what they were hearing when that needle hit the vinyl, when they put on the headphones, whether it was in a coffee shop, whether it was at a friend's house, wherever it could have been, and however they stumbled upon the album, what they were hearing was the beginning of something. It was the beginning of a movement. It was the beginning of what would eventually become what we know as the Christian music industry, or as the beginning of contemporary Christian music, or the CCM industry. They would not have understood that. So what I wanted to do, even though, and look, it was really, I mean, from a human perspective, last night or early this morning, it was an accident in some ways that I just happened to pull that album out of all of the stacks. I mean, I could go down to the garage now. There's still stacks upon stacks. There's CDs everywhere. I just happened in one of the stacks to stumble upon Love Song by Love Song. And I happened to do it on March the 9th, when the day after tomorrow is the anniversary of the album. I mean, come on. You can't just say, well, let's just ignore it. Nobody listening to the podcast will care. I think it's a great story. I think it's an interesting story. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go back. We're going to go back before Christian bookstores were filled with, contemporary Christian music. We're going to go back before Christian radio charts even existed. We're going to go back before Petra. We're going to go back before Mylan and the Broken Heart. We're going to go back before For Him. We're going to go way back before Jennifer Knapp. We're going to go back before Michael W. Smith, before DC Talk, before that entire contemporary Christian music culture that many of us grew up in. Many of you grew up in it as well. We're going to go back to 1972 to the album that in many cases, in many ways, helped start it all. It wasn't the only one. We could go back. Do not think for 1 second I'm forgetting like Larry Norman. Don't think I'm forgetting other names. But if you look up the most significant albums in the history of contemporary Christian music, almost any list you look at, Love Song by Love Song, 1972 is going to be on that list. I mean, or unless your list was compiled by someone who don't know the history of contemporary Christian music. It's a massively significant album from there. Now, whether you like the album, whether you understand the significance of the album is irrelevant. It is significant. That's just a historical fact. So, are you ready? Now, to understand, we're going to do some storytelling today, all right? It's Storytelling Monday with Theology Central Podcast. We're going to go back to 1972. In fact, we have to go back to a little bit before 1972. We have to go back to something referred to as the Jesus movement. Now, many people are very familiar with the Jesus movement, right? There's been movies, films, documentaries, articles, and we could have a long discussion about the Jesus movement, okay? We could have a long one. Now, to understand how this album comes into existence, I think we have to understand what is happening in America at the time, all right? So, early 1970s, and in some ways, and a lot of times when things happen in history, it's like the perfect storm. You have all the right conditions lining up just for something to become this massive moment in time. You just have to have all of the right elements, right? I mean, we could talk about, if we want to talk about in secular music, does Thriller by Michael Jackson, does that album become one of the greatest selling albums of all time? Does it become the cultural phenomenon that it became without MTV? Without the videos for Billie Jean, Beat It, and the Thriller video itself, which was a mini movie? Does it? So without MTV, without really the birth of music videos at that time, does the album become what it is? Sometimes you have to have all of the perfect elements. And those perfect elements coming together, they rarely can ever be repeated again. Whatever happens in the future will require its own. All the elements will have to come together for it to do what it does. So there's always a lot of different elements that come together. Well, for what's going to happen with Love Song in 1972, well, you need a lot of the elements going on in the culture at the time. Of course, Vietnam, the optimism of the 60s, it's fading, right? The optimism is gone. There's more of a skepticism. There's a cynicism. There's a questioning of institutions. There's a questioning of so many different things. You can think of it this way. The counterculture, and maybe this is, I think, relatively true of a lot of the hippie movement, they promise peace. They promise freedom. And they may have looked around going, wait a minute, we're not getting the peace and the freedom. They felt disillusioned. We get war. We get Vietnam. We get all of the different things going on in the culture. So in the middle of all of that cultural confusion, something starts happening. I think it's fair to say, I think I'm being historically accurate. Let me say this. I won't say across. In many parts of the United States, that's more accurate, especially along the West Coast. Thousands of young people from the hippie movement started becoming Christians. Now, we could have a massive theological discussion about what happens here, right? We could talk about what were they converted to? What were they converted by? What was their understanding? Were they merging some hippie ideas with Christianity? We could get into a big discussion about all of that. But there's no way to deny that they were coming from the hippie movement and they were now turning to Jesus in some way, shape, or form. We could get into an argument about the theological understanding of conversion here, but there's no way to get around. Something is happening. They started becoming Christians. Now, this was not happening through large denominational campaigns. This was not happening through elaborate church programs. I guess the only way to kind of describe it is it starts happening through conversations, small Bible studies, people just getting baptized on the beach. This was informal gatherings of people searching for meaning, searching for answers, searching for something more than maybe what the counterculture had given them. Peace, freedom, a lot of that they were disillusioned with, and now they're looking for something else. But I want you to note this. This was happening outside of the church. This wasn't happening inside the church. And this kind of inside outside thing could lead to a lot of conversations. Now, what is happening here, later on, historians are going to look back and call that's the Jesus movement. All right? Now, this is the thing to understand. These people who are becoming Christians, they don't look like the church crowd. They have long hair. They're wearing jeans. Maybe they have shoes. Maybe they don't have shoes. Or maybe they're just wearing sandals. And many of them have come directly out of the drug culture of the 1960s. But they're now talking about Jesus. And they talked about him with an enthusiasm that many of the churches, did not have. Many of the churches had not seen. There was an enthusiasm. There was a passion. There was something going on. They studied the Bible together. They met in homes. They gathered in the park. Sometimes hundreds of young people would just show up somewhere to hear someone teach the scriptures. And this was all happening, for the most part, outside of the church. The church is still there as an institution, but all of this is really going on without the institution, without it, without an industry. This is not happening because of the Christian publishing industrial complex. This is happening without the Christian music industrial complex because it doesn't even really exist. And the church itself is kind of just almost on the sidelines looking like, what is going on here? Many of them, this is very important, would criticize it. They would be like, oh, they're still hippies. They didn't really believe. They're still ungodly. Like they would almost criticize it and probably see a lot of it as being, if we used our modern day terminology, they're progressive, they're left, they're woke, they're not really being, they would still bring in a lot of their ideas from their times as, quote unquote, being hippies. Now, one of the places, and you know this, there was a movie about this, a movement begins to take shape was, one of the places, I should say, where this movement was taking place was a growing church in Southern California called Calvary Chapel, led by Pastor Chuck Smith. Now, I always make the joke that when I come along to Christianity as a teenager in the 80s, I would come home from school, turn on Christian radio. I had 3 notebooks. And every day after school, I would listen to 3 programs, right? The first one was Chuck Swindoll, Insight for Living. Boom. I would take notes. Chuck Swindoll, he was a master of storytelling, and he was a master of applying the scriptures. So I would learn storytelling and applying the scriptures. That was my Chuck Swindoll notebook. The other notebook was John MacArthur. I would take notes on his messages, and it was all about exposition, exegetical preaching, verse by verse. And so those notebooks were filled. I can't even tell you how many notebooks were filled. I listened to everything those men would say and try to get any book that they wrote. So that's what was shaping me theologically. The third one was Chuck Smith. Okay? Now, that notebook, and I'm going to be honest with you, was blank. I didn't get why Chuck Smith was even on Christian radio. Here's how I perceived Chuck Smith. Because I had no idea as a teenager about the Jesus movement, the birth of CCM. I didn't know any of this. I just saw Chuck Smith as, who is this old guy who is boring and I don't get anything from his sermons. That's how I perceived him. I would have not have understood he was so instrumental in this whole counterculture movement. To me, Chuck Smith was, really? I almost wanted to call the Christian radio station like, come on, anybody, just put anybody, give someone a microphone, anybody. What is this? Okay, I did not get it. I did not like it. And I'm not trying to be super critical. I didn't have necessarily a theological reason. I just didn't. No, Swindoll intrigued me, fascinated me. He had me in many cases with every word, and especially the way he told stories. MacArthur, I felt like, yeah, I'm digging into scripture. And Smith, I thought, is it over yet? Okay, I know. That's really bad. But I want you to understand my interaction with this story, okay? So here's Chuck Smith. Now, Chuck Smith does something very revolutionary. And if you've watched the movie, I can't remember the name of the movie about this entire thing, but you can see a little bit about what happened. He did something interesting. Instead of pushing these young converts away because, hey, wait a minute. No. You don't look right. You don't talk right. No, he didn't do that. He welcomed them in. Come on, bring in your bare feet. You don't need shoes. It doesn't matter. You don't need to cut your hair. Bring in all of your countercultural background. Bring it all in. And suddenly, his church is filled with all of these young believers who don't look the right way, who don't talk the right way, who don't sound the right way. And guess what? Many of them had been musicians. They played guitars. They wrote songs. They grew up in the California, what will we call it? Folk rock scene of the late 1960s. That's where they grew up. That's what they knew. So guess what they decided to do? I know it sounds revolutionary. They began to do something that I guess had not really, it's been done by some, but for the most part, it hadn't been done before. They just started writing songs about Jesus using the musical language of their generation, not the musical language of the church, not the musical language of the hymns. They didn't know any of that. They'd come from the hippie culture, think Woodstock, think the Beatles, think that. They're coming from a whole different musical framework, and they just bring the musical language they know. And what most churches would do is like, nope, you got to get rid of all of that. You got to burn all of that. You got to repent of all of that. Now, this is the musical language you must use. Chuck Smith said, well, just bring in your musical language and sing about Jesus. Now, I know I'm oversimplifying it, but you're getting the basic idea of what happened. So they just start writing songs about Jesus. They use the guitars. They use harmonies. They use folk rock. They don't use hymns. They're not using traditional gospel. They're not using Southern gospel. So in some ways, I think there's only one way to describe it. It's something new, especially now the sound of the music is not new, but the fact that it's the sound of that music with these lyrics, that becomes new. And it's out of that environment that emerged a group of musicians who decided to call themselves Love Song. Now, by the early 1970s, Jesus movement is spreading all across mainly Southern California. Now, among these new believers, several musicians began writing songs about their faith. This includes Chuck Girard, Jay Truax, Tom Coombs, Fred Field, and John Meller. And if I'm saying any of their names incorrect, I apologize. I haven't heard their names in, 40 years? Okay, so Chuck Girard, Jay Truax, Tom Coombs, Fred Field, John Meller, and this is important about these people who come together. They're not trying to launch a commercial musical career. They're not even thinking about that. They just simply want to express their faith through the music that they know. There's no can we get a record contract? Can we get on TikTok? Can I build my YouTube channel? Can I get on The Voice? Can I get on American Idol? Can I get signed by, this record company? No. It's nothing like that because that doesn't exist. They're not even thinking about that. We have faith in Jesus. We want to express our faith in Jesus with the music that we know, and this is the music we know. There's a purity and a beauty about it, at least at that level. I'm not saying all the people involved were perfect because they're all sinners just like I am. But they weren't trying to launch a commercial career because there would have been no well, how is this even going to work? Now, these songs that they wrote, these songs that they put together begin to spread through the gatherings that were occurring. So-called church services, many cases outside of the church. Coffee house meetings. There was a lot of these coffee houses that exist, and especially during the Jesus movement, they would come to the coffee house to play their music, to give testimony, to have a Bible study. The coffee house, in many cases, I don't know if I can historically say this dogmatically, the coffee house may have been more influential and more instrumental in a lot of this than the church. Much of the church was still resistant to a lot of this, and look, I want to make this very clear. Some of what the church spoke against would have been accurate. Look, a lot of things in the Jesus movement we could criticize. Theological depth, okay, did it even really exist? Emotionalism, I mean, we could get into a lot of what was happening, but this was happening for the most part outside of the church. This was being spread, and these songs were spreading not only through the coffee houses, I guess we could call them youth events. People who heard them would describe the atmosphere as that it felt more like a revival than a concert. It didn't feel like here's the next big name. Let's buy a ticket and let's get in. It was like, no, they were coming together for do we say worship? Do we say to express faith? They were just living out their faith. It wasn't like, buy a ticket to come see the next big thing. Now, of course, we know how everything's going to change, but at this very moment, now, it doesn't last a long time, but there is a purity in this from a human perspective. I'm not saying from a theological perspective, because obviously it was still tainted by sin and ungodliness, because what isn't? Now, in this moment, as the movement begins to grow, the leaders at Calvary Chapel begins to realize something. These songs are spreading rapidly, but they only exist in live performances, right? If you're not at the coffee house, if you're not at the service, if you're not at the gathering, everyone can talk about the songs, but the songs aren't there. So the church basically forms a music label called Maranatha Music. And they decide, let's record them. Now, at least, I'm always skeptical, but I'm going to say at least at some part, the goal was not necessarily commercial success. It was what they really wanted to do was to capture the sound of what was happening spiritually among the young believers, at least to some level. There's probably someone who thought, wait a minute, this could turn into something. I'm not saying that there wasn't anybody there thinking that, but at least in part, I think the motives were somewhat pure, all right? Now, the recording was obviously modest. There was no massive studio. There was no budget. It was just a straightforward recording reflecting the musical influences of the time. Folk rock, acoustic arrangements, vocal harmonies. And when the album Love Song is finally released, now, just so that you know, there is much historical dispute. Was it March the 10th, 1972? Some say there's no way to definitively say, because it didn't have the typical album release like you would think of an album being released because this is all happening outside of industry. This is all happening outside of marketing campaigns. But at least Spotify seems to acknowledge it. I think some of the other streaming services give the same date. March the 10th, 1972 seems to be the date that many agree on. Many argue against it. So I just want to make that for historical accuracy. Somewhere in 1972, the album Love Song by Love Song is released, and there's no major marketing campaign. The music spreads the same way the movement had been spreading. The coffee houses, some of the churches that were accepting the Jesus movement, the few small Christian bookstores, and a lot of this would have been spreading probably more in the California area. People bought the album, and guess what they did? They shared it with their friends. Hey, have you heard this? Word of mouth carried the music across the entire movement. And, this is important, among the young believers, their response is enthusiastic. For many of them, it's the first time, for many, I'm not saying for all, I'm not saying this is a dogmatic fact, I'm saying from the perception of the young people at the time, this would have been the first time they heard modern music with openly Christian lyrics. All right? And that's a pretty amazing thing. I will never forget how I stumble upon it. Now, I'm going to skip a little bit ahead. We're going to leave the 70s for a minute. Now we can go to Buffalo Gap, Texas. Buffalo Gap, Texas. I'm doing what I typically do. I'm sitting on the floor in front of my stereo equipment. I've got headphones on, just like I was doing around 2 a.m. this morning. I was sitting in front of my stereo equipment with headphones on. I've been doing that my whole life. And I'm sitting there, and I thought on this particular day, I always check all the radio stations back then, right? What's going on the radio stations? What are they playing? What am I missing? Because that's the only way you could really figure out what's going on other than just spending hours in a record store going through stacks. And maybe you knew what it was. Maybe you had no idea. There wasn't a lot of different ways. They were limited in a lot of the ways you could discover stuff. Okay, I know it's hard for some people to comprehend that, but it just was. You couldn't just sit there in a music streaming service, look at everything that was released and just play whatever you want. You were limited by money, by access. But radio was the king at the time. So I'm going through and I'm going, and I get like all the way down to the end of the FM dial, and then I switch back over to the top of the FM dial, right? Or you can say go the opposite way, and one is the bottom of the top. But for me, I start back at I get back at the top of the FM dial, and I start going through, and all of a sudden there's a station there, like at 88.1 FM. I'm like, what? Wait, stop. And I go back. Ooh, it's coming in nice and clear. It's got a strong signal. And I turn up the volume. I'm like, what is this music? What is this music? It has a contemporary sound, but I can't name it. And whenever I hear music that I don't know, that's a pretty shocking thing. It's always been, right? Like if I turn on the radio and I don't know the song, just pull over the car, stop, something. Either it's brand new or something went wrong. Something is wrong in the matrix because I better know every song of every era, of every genre of music. And if I don't know it, I'm upset because somehow I missed it and I'm going to punish myself or punish the person who didn't allow me to hear it. Okay. So I'm like, what is this? I go to the next song. Wait, what is this? Wait. And then all of a sudden it dawned on me, wait, they're talking about God. Wait, they're talking about Jesus. What is this? Then I'm thinking like, did I just fall off into the Twilight Zone? I know that's a very dated reference. What is happening? Did I get pulled into some kind of weird, I don't know. What is happening? It's some kind of, I don't know what's going on. Like, what is happening? What is this? Right? And I'm like, what is happening? So I keep listening and I keep listening. And if the DJ mentions something, I start writing down like, okay, who's this? And I got my notebook going. I'm like, this artist and who's this and I've never heard of any of these people. I'm like, this is the craziest thing I've ever heard of in my life. So finally I call the radio. I find out the name of the radio station. I try to find a phone number. I think the DJ gives the number. I call and I'm like, who are you people? What is this? I'm like, you gave this song? Where do I get this album? Right? And they're like, well, you got to go to what would be a Christian record store. I'm like, do they exist? I'm like, what's a Christian record store? Like I'm talking to the DJ like, dude, are you real? Like, are you on drugs? Like, what are you talking about? And so I'm like, wait, there's a place in the mall called the Love Shack? I think that's what it was called. Not from the B-52s. Love Shack. Okay, all right. That's a different song. Okay, but there was a little place called the Love Shack. And I'm like, what in the world is the Love Shack? I'd been to the mall a million times. I never even paid attention to this place. So I find a way to get to the mall. I go in. I don't even remember the name of the first album, but I bought it and I'm like, and that began my discovery of this music. So I can imagine when these young people heard Love Song in 1972, for many of them, it's the first time and it feels crazy. It's like, whoa, Now we're really counterculture. We got our music talking about Jesus. Oh, this is like, this is for someone who doesn't want to go with the flow, someone who wants to be countercultural. How counterculture can you be? Oh, and to make it even better, the churches don't like it. They're suspicious of this satanic rock style music. Guitars, drums, that's secular culture. You should avoid it. It's evil. Now you got the best of both worlds, right? You're counterculture to the culture and you're counterculture to the church. I mean, come on. You can't beat this. This is the best thing that could ever happen to you, right? Or at least for me. That's how I felt about it. I could be way different than ever. This is like punk. This is like being truly punk rock, right? This is like, I am so different than everybody. I'm different than the world, and I'm even different than the church because the church itself is against most of this. Let me buy 15 copies of this, all right? That's how it felt. And I don't know how it felt to those young people, but there had to be a little bit of that, all right? So when bands like Love Song appear, the church reactions, I mean, some welcomed, but many resisted it and resisted it strongly. But the movement continued to grow, and that music continued to spread. Now, I think one of the most fascinating things about the early Jesus, I think it's important to say, one of the most fascinating things about the early Jesus music movement is how different it would be, or how different it was from the Christian music industry that comes later. See, in the early 70s, there was no Christian music charts. Christian radio rarely played any contemporary music. I mean, even into the 80s, a lot of the stations still wouldn't play it, or they would only play it on Saturday night. I mean, it was even all those years later. So, and this idea of a commercial Christian music industry, that's years away. It's going to show up, but it's still a ways away. The music was spreading through community. Basically, you had young people gathering together in living rooms, fellowship halls, coffee houses. Someone would pick up a guitar, the room would begin to sing, and the songs were written for that environment. Simple, acoustic, easy for people to learn and sing together. The music was for people to participate in, right? People did not just listen, they were to join in. And because of that, I think it's difficult to measure which songs from that era were most popular in the modern sense. There was no charts. There was no radio play statistics. But people, if we go back into history and talk to the people who were there in the 70s, really two songs become very instrumental from the Love Song album, Love Song in 1972. The first one is Little Country Church. Now you can go to any music streaming service, look up Love Song, 1972, and look for, and you'll the cover, you'll see the cover. It looks like a piece of music. You'll see it. It should be easy to find. But the one song that kind of becomes, maybe it's the most remembered song from the album, is Little Country Church. Musically, it's pretty simple. I mean, all the songs on the album are musically very simple. You have acoustic guitars, gentle harmonies. Again, kind of this folk style, typical of Southern California, especially in the early 70s. All right. And I don't want to go through, well, yeah, I could try to break down all of the lyrics to Little Country Church. I will just point you to two songs. I'm not going to go through all the lyrics because I'm already at 47 minutes. And so I want to tell the full story here. So check out Little Country Church. It kind of becomes the theme, right? Little Country Church on the edge of town, people coming every day from miles around. It really describes what was going on in the Jesus movement, right? A preacher isn't talking about religion no more. He just wants to praise the Lord. I mean, the song is celebrating this kind of revival. That little church has come alive. And then we have this famous line in the song, long hair, short hair, some coats and ties. Like, hey, we can all come together. You can have your short hair, you can have your coat, you can have your tie, I can have my long hair, maybe no shoes, we should all be able to come together to praise the Lord. It's kind of the idea, all right? So that song was, and some, I don't know if it's fair to say, it became a theme. It did not become the theme. It becomes a theme of the early Jesus movement. I think that's fair to say. The other song is Two Hands, all right? So think of it this way, if Little Country Church kind of describes the movement, the atmosphere, Two Hands reveals something happening and how they understood the gatherings. Because Two Hands is about evangelism. So in the Jesus movement, the gatherings were expected. I guess what was expected is, in the Jesus movement gathering, they would expect that there would be people there who weren't believers, who were doubters, skeptical, or questioning, or searching. So in a sense, in the Jesus movement, friends brought friends, and their friends were not necessarily other believers. So we have lines like, we're all gathered here because we all believe. Now, if there's a doubter in the crowd, we ask you not to leave, because the idea is there's going to be a doubter. With one, so we have this idea of two hands. With one, reach out to Jesus, and with the other, bring a friend. And so the Jesus movement was this idea of, hey, we're all gathered together to praise the Lord. Let's bring a friend. Very much an evangelistic idea. All right. Now, why does this album even matter? Why am I talking about it on a Monday in 2026? Well, it's the day before its anniversary, but I think we can ask the question, does the album even matter today? So why does it matter? Well, maybe it matters because it captured a movement as it was happening. The people who recorded the songs were not trying to build a music industry. They were simply expressing their faith at that time. So it captures what believers felt and believed and thought about in March of 1972. But in so doing, they kind of established something. They kind of established this idea that musical language of contemporary culture could carry a Christian message, or at least that's the idea they try to put forth. Hey, we can take the musical language of the culture and we can carry a Christian message within that musical language. And that idea may not sound so revolutionary to you in 2026. That musical idea was going to completely reshape Christian music for decades to come. From those early years, I mean, everything was going to change. You can think of it this way. We'll say, forget the early years. From those early songs, let's state it that way. Guess what's going to grow from those early years and those early songs? You're going to get Christian record labels. You're going to get Christian radio. You're going to get Christian music festivals. And you're going to get the entire world of what we sometimes abbreviate as CCM, contemporary Christian music. Now, that's 1972. You jump to about 1982, and everything is changing. What started as a kind of a grassroots spiritual movement begins to develop a structure around it. Record labels form. Bookstores began stocking growing numbers of albums. By the time I walk into the Bible bookstore in the 1980s, there's one half of the store is music. In fact, you walk into the store and then you look immediately to your right, there were these steps. You took 3 or 4 steps up and you're in this large area of just all music. The whole section was music. Christian radio stations started experimenting with contemporary Christian music. Right across the street from the Bible bookstore was 88.1 KG&Z. The good news, contemporary Christian music was being played on KG&Z. That's where I first discovered it. Concert tours began to draw large crowds, and slowly, almost quietly, the Jesus movement, that in some ways was outside of the church, kind of gets co-opted by the church. It kind of just gets swallowed up by the church, just kind of becomes the church. And the next thing you know, that Jesus movement, at least the music of it, turns into an industry. And by the 80s, what we call contemporary Christian music is in full effect. It's taken shape. Artists now signs to record contracts. Albums are professionally produced. Radio stations determine which songs are going to be heard across the country and which songs are not, which songs are allowed, which songs are not allowed. Christian music festivals draw thousands of fans. And the movement that began with guitars in a living room had grown into a massive cultural system of its own. And the church is going to try to control it. Hey, now, you're going to be a Christian artist. You got to talk this way. You got to sound this way. You got to dress this way. No, 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 no. You can't sing about that. No, you can't use that word. And so the church that rejected it now wants to control it. Oh, we could get into a whole discussion about that. Now, none of this growth and what it kind of starts growing into, I'm not going to say it was all bad because the industry allowed Christian music to reach millions of people. It would never have reached me without, in some sense, the industry forming. But something did change. In the early days of the Jesus movement, the music belonged to the community. People just did not listen to the songs, they sang them. They learned them in living rooms, in small gatherings and coffee houses and in church fellowship halls. But as the industry grew, the relationship to the music began to shift. Songs were no longer something necessarily that you participated in. They were something you consumed, something you watched. The artist becomes performers. We become spectators. And the simple kind of the participation, kind of the spirit of participation, it gives way to an organized professional system where I hear the commercial, I buy the product, I get a ticket for the concert. They're their entertainer. It becomes entertainment. There's no way to really get around it. It becomes entertainment. No matter how much Christian artists would try to say, we're ministry, it becomes entertainment. Now, looking back at the story of Love Story, 1972, I think a few things become clear. Movements that begin in ways that are simple and unplanned. The musicians and the artists who recorded those songs, they weren't trying to create an industry. They were simply expressing their faith in the language of the culture around them. So I think a lot of times movements actually begin in ways that are simple and unplanned. I think maybe that's the way to say it. Maybe one of the first lessons we say this. A lot of times within the church, the history of the church, movements begin in simple, unplanned ways. It's not like, oh, we have this strategy to do this, but sooner or later, whatever starts simple and unplanned is ultimately going to be swallowed up by some industry. And the church is ultimately always going to try to control it. I think another lesson is the relationship between faith and culture. I don't think it's ever simple. I think the Jesus movement showed that contemporary music could be used to express devotion to Christ. But it was going to raise questions that the church, was going to fight about for decades, and the church still fights about it. It's always going to fight about it. The church demands things to be their way, and if it doesn't fit their little box, the church will rebel against it. Now, sooner or later, other churches will accept it, and then, we could get into all of that. But even the churches that accept it will still try to control it, right? No. You're a Christian artist. How dare you sing about divorce? You cannot sing about divorce. No, you can't. All of a sudden, the church is going to tell you what you can and cannot sing. In some ways, the church it would have been better in some ways for the Jesus movement and the Christian music world to stay outside of the church in some ways. That's a whole discussion in and of itself. We could say a lot more, but I think we'll just try to wrap this up. I mean, I'm right at 60 minutes. So now I'm going to try to turn this story to be more personal. I've tried to add a lot of my own personal elements to this, but now I'm going to be very personal here, very transparent. There's something I have to admit when I think about all of this, and when I think about all of the thoughts I was having at 2 a.m. while listening to Love Song by Love Song. When I look back at kind of the early days of the Jesus movement and the beginning of what eventually became contemporary Christian music, I do find myself very conflicted. I'm just going to be honest with you. If I look back to a lot of the contemporary Christian music history, going all the way back to the Jesus movement, and I do so from a theological perspective, because this is called the Theology Central podcast, man, I could criticize stuff all day. Man, much of the teaching from that era was, I mean, come on, theologically, a lot of it was shallow, and that's being nice. I could probably say a lot of it was garbage. The interpretation of Scripture, what in the world was that? The emotionalism, sometimes it was more enthusiasm than it was depth. And at times it was there was kind of a theological, they were naive theologically, right? I mean, it's hard to ignore that. So from a doctrinal and hermeneutical perspective, much of it was a mess. It was a train wreck. There's no way to get around it. I can go through stacks of some of these albums and go, what in the, what? No. But at the same time, there's something else there. And this is hard to define. And I don't know if you're going to understand this. Maybe if you didn't live it, you're not going to understand this. But I can't dismiss it. There was kind of a sincerity. There was like a human genuineness. There was an organic expression of faith that didn't feel manufactured. It felt like these were people who had encountered Christ. They encountered truth. And they believed it had changed their lives, and they were simply trying to express that in language of their generation. And maybe that's the way you should look at it. It's people just expressing it in the best way they could. Should I criticize it theologically? Well, on one hand, I have to, because they're talking about God. They're talking about faith. They're talking about Jesus. They're talking about the Bible. So in some ways, I do have to criticize it theologically. But at the same time, there's something beautiful about the emotion and the realness and rawness of it. It did not feel forced. In fact, a lot of it was outside of the culture of the church, which I have more problems sometimes with the culture of the church than these people with no shoes on, long hair, singing about Jesus outside of the church. Even when the industry begins to form, when the record labels start coming together, when the albums begin to sell, most of those labels at that time were started by Christians who all they really wanted to do was share the music that spoke about their faith. It wasn't a polished system. And there was something that felt spontaneous, something that felt alive. And I can't express to you how important many of these albums were. They expressed my faith and my very naive, untheologically sophisticated. I didn't know hermeneutics yet. I was still just learning, but it captured the emotion and the feeling. And there was something beautiful and powerful about that, because I still didn't understand, especially for me. I didn't even know that there was an industry or not an industry. I felt like I was listening to ooh, this is some underground, countercultural thing. And I didn't care. I didn't know of any of this other stuff that even existed yet, or that it was coming into shape. But over time, something shifted. There's no way to get around it. What began as a movement becomes a system. What started as grassroots develops into an industry, with structures, with expectations, with marketing strategies, with now people looking to have a career, a #1 album, a Dove Award. And when that happened, that early simplicity, that early genuineness fades away. Now, I don't want to fall into some trap of saying that everything was better back in my day, young ones. I hate that. I hate that. Because things weren't all better back then. It wasn't. They were still sinners. There were still wrong motives. Go back to the early Jesus movement and look what happens to a lot of those artists. Their lives fall apart. Marriages fell apart. There was all kinds of problems and sin because that's what's always going to exist no matter where you look, because the church is made up of sinners. And I just wish the church's theology would reflect that reality. The church never accepts that reality. Because what happens when these artists messed up or fell, they got kicked to the curb, blacklisted, and thrown into the trash heap. And we found our next artist and said, oh, look at them. They look pretty. They sound good. They have perfect teeth. Let's put them on stage. And then when they mess up, we'll throw them to the curb and we'll find someone else. We'll just keep replacing the next big thing because we demand perfection. Instead of expecting these people just to be musicians who are sinners trying to sing about their faith, perfectly or imperfectly. No, we want perfection. We want ministers. They weren't supposed to be ministers. They were supposed to be musicians singing about faith. There was real problems back then, as there always has been. But at the same time, something that once existed in that moment of history, from the Jesus movement to what happened in the 80s and to really the beginning of the 90s, that all is gone. That world, with all of its flaws, all of its sincerity, it's gone. And it's never coming back. And when I realize that, it makes me sad, makes me discouraged, makes me depressed. So that brings me back to 2:00 this morning. I was pulling old CDs off the shelf, albums that shaped a good portion of my life, music that connected me to a large part of my faith. It reminds me of Christian bookstores and a world that once felt like almost scandalous, like nobody knows about this, like I've discovered some hidden treasure. And sitting among all of those albums was a simple album from 1972, recorded by a group of believers who simply wanted to write songs about Jesus. And they had no idea what would come from that album. But listening to those songs now, 50 years later? Right? I mean, I don't know math, 50 years later, more than 50 years later, I think you can still hear something different if you'll go listen to it today. You can hear the sound of a movement that was still very new. It was still simple. It was still discovering what it meant to follow Christ in a changing culture and what it meant to sing about Christ in the music language of the culture. So before the industry, before the charts, before the marketing, it was just a group of believers, a guitar, and a song about Jesus. Songs written by people who had no idea that they were standing at the very beginning of something that would eventually shape the musical life of millions of Christians and millions of you. Well, I don't know, millions won't hear this. Many of you, I should say that. Many of you, I wish millions would hear this, but many of you will be like, man, your life was touched in some way, shape, or form, if you were a Christian, by this Christian music industry. In many cases, started with something that existed before the industry. Love Song by Love Song, March the 10th, 1972. Is it a revolutionary album musically? No, it's not. Is it even anywhere close to my favorite Christian music album? No, nowhere close. In some ways, you're kind of like, that's it? That's it. It's only like 30, what is it? I got to look. It's 36 minutes long. It's only 36 minutes long. You start it and it's over. You're going to kind of be probably a little bit underwhelmed. You're going to be like, that's it? Maybe it's the simplicity, and that's it. That really makes it kind of stand out, kind of makes the story of Love Song by Love Song even more fascinating. You don't put that on and going, whoa, this is the greatest album I've ever heard, because it wasn't supposed to be, is this the greatest album you ever heard? It was supposed to be, hey, I'm just singing about Jesus. I don't care if it's the greatest song. It's not, there's no industry for this. It doesn't matter. It's not going to, is this going to be on the top 20 best albums of the year list? It wasn't. Is it going to get a 5-star review? It wasn't about any of that. And maybe that's what makes it fascinating. And that's what makes it so countercultural, even today. So, March the 9th, maybe go listen to Love Song on the day before its anniversary, if March the 10th is the date it was actually released. Or just wait till midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, and you can listen to it early on its anniversary. So, happy anniversary to Love Song, to the album Love Song. In many ways, you were the spark that changed the world of Christian music. We could say for the good, for the bad, for the ugly, I don't know. But it's a part of church history and music history, and we remember it. Thanks for listening. God bless.